Audio check. All right, good morning. And welcome to Docket 260510, application of the Connecticut Light and Power Company, DBA Energy, to amend its rate schedules. My name is Tom Wheel. I'm the chairman of the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. I'm joined today by my methodical colleagues, Vice Chairman David Arconti, Commissioners Jan Beecher, Holly Cheeseman, and Everett Smith. We're here today for a scheduling conference, and I'll give an overview of our goals for the conference in a moment, but I figured we could take appearances from all the parties and recognize interveners who are here today. So I'll start with the parties identified on the notice of proceeding, beginning with Eversource.
Good morning, Commissioners. Vincent Pace on behalf of the Connecticut Light and Power Company doing business as Eversource Energy, and I'm joined today by Attorney Cheryl Kimball.
Thank you. OCC.
Hi, I'm Kim White with OCC, and I'm joined by Consumer Counsel Coleman and Director Andrew Minikowski.
Thank you.
Morning.
Morning. Next, I have Deep on the notice of proceeding. I don't know. Thank you. Attorney Aniwichi.
Good morning, Attorney Aniwichi on behalf of Deep.
Thank you. EOE.
Brittany Wyman on behalf of EOE, joined by Attorney Jamie Spanik.
Thank you. Attorney General, we'll move on to the interveners, starting with the Attorney General's office.
John Wright on behalf of the Attorney General, and with me today is Caroline McCormick.
Thank you. CIEC.
Good morning, Commissioners. Jay Goodman for the Connecticut Industrial Energy Consumers.
Thank you. I'm going by order of intervener motion granting, so I'm not sure if we have everyone here for, do we have anyone from Acadia Center? Thank you.
Steve Sherry and Bernadette and Jackie here from the Shaw Law Group for Acadia Center as well.
Thank you. Welcome back, Attorney Sherry, to the hearing room. Is there anyone here from Amtrak? Okay. Anyone here from University of Connecticut? Anyone here from Sierra Club? And I was looking for you, Attorney Lon, and I skipped you on my list. Conservation Law Foundation.
Yes, thank you. Shannon Lon on behalf of Conservation Law Foundation.
Thank you. Walmart. NetSpeed. Interconnection Customer Coalition.
Customer Coalition.
Thank you. Zio. And NECTA. Thank you. And I think that's the total list of motions we've granted for intervener status. So like I said at the start, I'll give a general overview of what we hope to accomplish today, mostly for any folks who might be watching, I think, for context. So as of right now, the procedural schedule on this docket, I think, still ends at today's date. So we don't have any established dates for any touch points kind of scheduled for this docket. And our goal is to hear from everyone today to help provide input to PURA staff and commissioners when we issue the formal schedule. So we have to establish a schedule that includes dates and locations for public comment hearings, any PURA staff audits, deadlines for pre-filed testimony, rebuttal and surrebuttal, end of discovery, evidentiary, and late file hearing dates, briefing deadlines, arguments, and decisions. Like I said, we'll consider input from any parties and interveners we get today about the schedule. Ultimately, we do have a statutory deadline we have to hit, and we need to establish enough time for PURA staff and commissioners to do our jobs. So it's always a little bit of a balancing act to kind of try to make a schedule that works for everyone. We did receive correspondence from Eversource, joint correspondence from Eversource, OCC, and EOE on August 5th that includes a proposed schedule and also includes some other suggestions like locations for public comment hearings, and we will discuss that later. But I think we have a presentation from Eversource, so we'll start with that presentation.
So if we could please have PURA bring up the presentation, and while we're doing that, we're going to have each of these CLMP representatives please identify themselves for the record by providing your name and title. Starting with Mr. Scacco.
Good morning. Don Scacco, President of Connecticut Electric Operations.
Good morning. Brendan O'Brien, Vice President of Rates and Revenue Requirements at Eversource Energy.
Good morning, Garrett Murray, Director of Revenue Requirements for Eversource Energy Service Company.
And so, Mr. Scacco, you can proceed with our presentation. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you. So good morning, pleasure to be here with you today. I new in this role, just started actually July 5th. Mother Nature welcomed me in with a major storm that day. But I've been with the company for over 30 years. I'm in year 31 presently. Been fortunate enough to work in a variety of different roles over the years, from the beginning of my career, customer operations, transitioned over to various roles in the engineering group and field engineering, moved into electric operations as a supervisor of crews during emergencies, assistant manager multiple times, manager and director and vice president. And now in this role, other than leaving to go to school, go away to college, I've been a resident of Connecticut my whole life. As you know, our system is very large and complicated. Over 750,000 poles, 250,000 transformers, service transformers, and almost 200 substations, over 24,000 miles of wire and cable. And our territory is divided into 3 divisions. We have 12 work centers that are strategically positioned within those divisions. We have our Eastern Division, which has Danielson, East Hampton, Madison, and New London. Central Division has Tolland, Hartford, and Cheshire. And our Western Division has Torrington Falls Village, Newtown, Waterbury, Norwalk, and Stamford. And our core team, we have a very large, impressive operations team. We have operationally focused vice presidents, 3 of them that handle 3 different specific areas.
And we'll have Mr. Bumpin move to the next slide, please. Thank you.
So Chris Colorio is our VP of System Operations, Electric System Operations. Chris has the dispatch center, which is called the SOC. We have a lot of acronyms. The SOC is the System Operations Center. Those are the dispatchers that quarterback the movement of our crews on a blue sky day. Chris also has the RSO, Response Specialist Organization. As the name indicates, they are our first responder line workers that are on shift 24/7, 365. Alan Lawrence, he's our Vice President of Stations, Substation Operations and Field Engineering, Field Communications. Alan's team, they have electricians and others that are focused on our substations. And Clifford Williams, Cliff has a significant team as well. Cliff's team manages street lighting, special projects, system projects, but primarily the large part of his team are the line workers and cable splicers that we're familiar with, that drive out of and work out of those 12 area work centers. So the day-to-day responsibilities that we're familiar with, the customer work, the maintenance work, and the reliability work, that's the primary blue sky function of the employees that work out of those 12 area work centers. But another very important service we provide is working during emergency restoration events. And we need to have staff that's ready 24/7, 365, but also scalable. So our grid, massive and complicated, but our team understands those complexities very well, and they're well positioned to operate it efficiently and safely. The team is responsible for keeping the lights on. They know that that is their primary function and primary role. And it has to happen regardless of what day it is, what time it is. A very good example is what happened on this past Friday night. Regular kind of your expected summer thunderstorms were predicted. Possible, that some additional energy in the storms, but nothing extraordinary. But as we experienced, and one of the indicators, tools that we use told us that we should expect between 60 and 120 outage trouble spots. We had over 800 trouble spots with almost 60,000 customers out. That means that the team that was expecting to have a regular weekend after work was completed on a Friday night ended up working, until midnight Friday. Crews working around the clock. Management team was plugged in and stood up and scaled to the event. Worked all night Friday, all day Saturday into Sunday to restore customers, and happy to do it. That's what they love to do. So during a major restoration event, we decentralize, just to give you a couple of seconds on that. So As I mentioned, Chris's team, the SOC, they're quarterbacking Blue Sky. When the span of control is such and the need arises for management of more staff beyond what the SOC is capable of handling, we decentralize to 3 EOCs, or Emergency Operations Centers. Our EOCs are in New London, Hartford, and in Newtown. Division directors during a Blue Sky Day become EOC directors. Within each respective EOC, we have restoration management teams, RMTs. Those are either 2 or 3 person teams. Restoration management teams handle between 30 and 50 crews. And during a minor, full-scale restoration, we would stand up between 12 to 15 restoration management teams for the state, but we have the ability to scale up to over 60. So we have the operational control and ability to manage thousands of crews if need be. So just a couple of other points. So our physical workforce, it's important for me to mention that they are, sometimes we feel, forgotten first responders. They are responding to emergency events with wires down and transformers leaking oil and dangerous situations. They're the first ones to get there, and they triage and handle the site and make it safe for our customers. They're highly skilled, highly trained. They take the work very seriously, and they're very proud to do that work. And we take training very seriously at the company as well. We have a robust training facility and training program. For example, some of our field employees, line workers, for example, have an apprenticeship that is 4.5 years long. Make sure that they are properly trained. The safety program, just to mention that very briefly, we're proud of it. Over the past 18 months, we have focused on the important stuff, reducing our most dangerous activities, injuries, performing those activities. They're called in the industry SIFs, okay, or significant injury or fatality. We have reduced over 18 months SIFs. There's actuals and potentials, SIF A's and SIF P's. We've reduced the SIF P's by 50%. And our DART rate that you've probably heard of course, DART stands for days away, restricted, or transfer. That's a industry standard measurement of injuries, and those have been reduced 40%. We're very proud of that. I'm very proud to lead this team. We have 1,400 plus operationally specific employees, but 4,100 total Connecticut employees. And just to close, a couple other important points. Over the past 10 years, our customers have experienced increased reliability as a result of our strategic investment in the electric system. And that investment is, of course, necessary to maintain that level of affordable reliability that our customers have come to expect from us. We work year-round to make the grid smarter and more resilient so that customers experience fewer and shorter power outages. And we look forward to discussing how we're going to achieve this mission together with you. We're looking forward to that in great detail, to discuss it openly and transparently. The team is very proud of the work we do and the opportunity to showcase the people who come together to keep the lights on. All of us here have a shared responsibility to work together for all of our customers, and we understand the importance of this process. We're looking forward to demonstrating the importance of and the need to continue to build and maintain the grid, not only for today, but for the needs of Connecticut's future as well. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brendan.
Right. Next slide, please. And thanks, Don. And appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I see a lot of familiar faces in the room and some new ones that I look forward to, meeting and engaging with as we kick off in this proceeding. And similar to Don, I as well am a proud Connecticut resident and UConn alumni, as my wife would say, probably at times a little bit too proud or passionate of a UConn fan at certain sporting events. But continuing here, what we've included in this slide is really an outline in summary of our overall case. And this listing here outlines the 17 separate pieces of testimony that we included in our initial application close to a month ago. And this is really built off the table of contents that we included in our initial application. And in those table of contents, you'll not only find the summary of all the different pieces of testimony that's outlined here, but also all the underlying supporting exhibits in detail as well. So just starting in terms of how we've categorized these, and color coded them to make this slide interesting. Starting in the light green here, this really includes a lot of the meat of our overall proposal in terms of different proposals for the authority to consider in this proceeding. And just to kind of go through these piece by piece quickly, starting with our leadership panel. In the leadership panel testimony, we have a number of different proposals that are outlined in there. And just to highlight a few, this includes our performance-based multi-year rate plan, or the PBMRP, as we've referred it to, and I'm sure I will struggle to continue to say that throughout this presentation. But in there, we outline a PBMRP that includes a 4-year stay-out provision, an I-X revenue cap calculation on O&M expenditures, a new proposed capital recovery mechanism, the continuation of the earnings sharing mechanism that has been in place since the prior decision, as well as multiple performance metrics, including asymmetrical and symmetrical PIMs, reporting metrics, and scorecards for the authority's consideration. In addition, we also included some proposed modifications to the storm cost recovery framework, including a proposal of a storm cost recovery adjustment factor, or SCRAF, which we'll get into a little more detail on the next slide. And as I mentioned, it also includes a number of different other proposals in outlining the next set of testimony, which is our Targeted System Performance Plan, or our TSP. And this set of testimony really outlines the overall state of the current electric distribution system here in Connecticut, as well as includes our proposed 5-year capital plan, outlining options for the authority's consideration regarding future investments to power Connecticut's future and the associated system performance, reliability, and resiliency performance. The next set of testimony is our AMI proposal. This testimony outlines the AMI implementation plan that we are proposing over the next 6 years, beginning in 2027, and provides a cost recovery framework as directed by the authority in the recent decision in docket number 171046 REO4 just a few months ago. And it also outlines some potential opportunities for the use of securitization to recover incremental O&M costs, as well as any stranded meter costs associated with a potential AMI deployment. And then moving to the final two, the PBR testimony includes our independent expert, Ms. Julia Freyer from London Economics. And that testimony outlines in more detail our overall PBRMP plan, which is also outlined in the leadership testimony, as well as some of the key studies and analysis performed to support that framework. And then finally, we also included an affordability framework for consideration, which represents the testimony of Mr. Matt Nelson and Mr. Michael Goldman from Apex Analytics. In this affordability framework, we're proposing ways to achieve a more calibrated investment framework and continue to enhance the customer assistance programs that we have here in Connecticut. And this next section is obviously near and dear to my heart and Mr. Murray's heart, who's here to my left, and outlines the overall revenue requirements section of our testimony. And here, this really incorporates and encapsulates all pieces of testimony that we've presented here in the calculation of the total revenue deficiency. And as you'll see on the slide here and was outlined in our initial proposal, we've included two separate numbers, the first being $727 million, which is inclusive of storms, and that's storms from 2018 through March of 2025, being recovered over a proposed typical 6-year recovery model. And that the bill impact there would be approximately a $33 a month rate increase, or 18%. Important to note there, though, obviously, based on from a timing perspective, filing the case on July 14th, this does not yet incorporate the final decision in docket number 251213 that was issued on July 29th. We also provided a baseline base revenue deficiency that's exclusive of storms, which totals about $451 million and would represent about a $20 bill increase, or 11% overall. And finally, just to outline the exhibits and attachments included here, this is where you'll find all the supporting standard filing requirements and SFR schedules supporting the calculation of our overall revenue deficiency. And then to just quickly go through the other pieces here, all the items highlighted in gray are really some of the key supporting pieces of testimony that we've included and include a lot of supporting detail and information that build up to the revenue requirement calculation. And just to highlight a few, our capital additions testimony outlines all of our processes and procedures specific to our in-service capital addition process, as well as supporting documentation for all capital additions from 2017 to date. And we plan, as Mr. Mario will discuss in a little more detail, to continue to provide that throughout the proceeding. We also have various different components, including our vegetation management plan, some information on our employee compensation and benefits process, including the annual review process for all employees. Our customer service testimony in our environmental plan also outlines not only the processes and procedures for each of those, but also includes some more detailed information on some of the performance metrics proposed for the customer suite that we've included in the PBMRP, as well as the GHG emissions reduction performance metric. And then we also have some expert testimony from a cost of capital perspective from Ms. Ann Bulkley from the Brattle Group, and our depreciation testimony in supporting depreciation study, which was put together by Mr. Ned Alice. And we also have included updated information for all storm costs requested from 2024 through March of 2025. And in there, we have provided, similar to Docket 25-1213 and Docket 240330, all detailed transactional information for the 14 storms being requested, which total about $157 million, and including all supporting information and invoices in that section. And finally, our rates testimony outlines all new proposed rates and includes our allocated cost of service and marginal cost of service studies. So that provides just an overview of the case. And again, I touched on some of these on the next slide. If we could just move to the slide 6. This outlines some of the key proposals that are included in our case. And just to highlight some of the overall statistics outlined on the right side of the slide here, this is for rates effective. Our proposal includes rates effective July 1st of 2027 and is based on a historical test year of 2025 with a proposed ROE of 10.25%. And as I mentioned, that incorporates a total revenue deficiency of about $727 million, or with an average customer bill impact of about 18%. But as I referenced on the previous slide, that does not yet accommodate any of the adjustments from the final decision in 25-12-13, nor does it include any of the potential decisions that might be rendered in the securitization docket and docket number 260404. From Attorney Pace, we'll go through in a little bit more detail the proposed procedural schedule. But as is indicated on the slide here, the proposed final decision date would be June 23rd of 2027. And then quickly just summarizing through, as I mentioned on the previous slide, our system development or targeted system performance plan includes a 5-year capital plan and incorporates an affordability framework that Apex has helped us to put together to calibrate our investments and maximize customer benefits while also continuing to enhance the customer assistance programs that we have. It also includes some detailed information regarding our AMI proposal and proposed changes to the vegetation management plan that we have, and provides options for PURA's consideration regarding the level of capital investment moving forward. On the PBRP, as I mentioned, we do have an annual inflation adjustment specific to O&M, as well as a new capital recovery mechanism that is proposed. As we've discussed previously, due to legislation changes, the company cannot continue or has not proposed the continuation of the Electric System Improvement, or ESI, capital recovery mechanism, which, as we indicated in our letter of intent, has allowed about $2.7 billion of the $3.3 billion in capital investments that have been made in between rate cases to be incorporated into rates. And that has allowed for slow and steady gradual increases in rates for customers to the tune of, on average, about $2 a year on a monthly basis. And the inclusion and continuation of the ESI prevented what would have been a significantly higher number presented here if not for the ESI proposal. And as we outlined in the LOI, we had estimated that to be about a 40% reduction because of the ESI. So we continue to believe and have proposed in this proceeding the continuation of a new capital recovery mechanism, which is outlined in our leadership testimony as I referenced. And then finally, just to close things out, as I mentioned, the storm cost recovery framework that we've included, or the SCRAF, as we've proposed in the proceeding. This would provide in base rates a level of storm funding relatively consistent to what we have currently, which would be about $60 million a year for catastrophic storms and about $4 million a year for pre-staging. And all of that would be based on a storm deferral threshold of about $5.4 million compared to the current $4 million that's in place. And we've certainly incorporated some of the feedback we've heard from PURA commissioners and staff and really all the stakeholders coming out of Docket 25, 12, 13 to have a process that enables the company to file storms for a prudence review on a more consistent basis. And our proposal there would be to file the previous year's storms on September 1st of each year, to conduct a contested proceeding over that next year to put those storm costs into rates effective the following September 1st, while providing PURA the ability to propose recovery over a period of 1 to 5 years, depending on the size of the deficiency identified compared to what's recovered in base rates. So that covers it for me for our key proposals, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Murray to move on to the next slide on capital.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. So we recognize that capital projects are a large component of our rate application. So in this slide, we wanted to highlight some of the project documentation we've included in our application and the company's proposal for updating actual capital additions throughout this proceeding. Between the company's capital testimony and supporting exhibits, we believe we've laid out the necessary support in a digestible and understandable format that can be used by PURA and other stakeholders to review the capital additions for prudence. The cost of service includes capital additions through June 30th, 2028. That includes actual capital additions through December 31st of 2025 and a forecasted plan in service for the period January 1, 26 through June 30th, 28. To support the 2017 through 2025 historical additions, I wanted to specifically point to 2 key exhibits. First is Exhibit CLP Additions 4, which contains a matrix showing total additions by project. Importantly, in this exhibit, the company also provides references and links to the second exhibit, which is CLP Additions 6. In CLP Additions 6, it contains all the historical project documentation. First, we provide cover sheets and closing reports, which provide a variance analysis on actual project costs compared to budget project costs, along with those actual costs by category pertaining to every work order. Separately, we've provided project authorization forms. In there, they provide an executive overview of the project, a description of the project, costs, justifications, and alternatives considered. In addition, we've also provided supplemental PAVs or supplemental project authorization forms when applicable. And lastly, we provided approvals, which are screenshots from the company's systems that shows the date on which each project has been approved. To support the capital placed in service after the test year, we plan on updating this supporting documentation throughout the proceeding. So on September 15th, 2026, the company plans to support actuals through June 30th of 2026, as well as also update the planned capital. And then monthly from there on, we plan to update on October 15th, November 15th, and December 15th. And depending on the procedural schedule that's established here today, if feasible, we'd provide additional updates while the record's open, either through a supplement before hearings or during a late file exhibit. And with that, I'll pass it over to Attorney Pace to talk about schedule.
So I'll first start with the proposed schedule, and I recognize that we submitted this with the EOE and the OCC on August 5th. I want to thank them for their cooperation in developing a proposal for PURA and other stakeholders to react to. I think what we hope you'll notice about this schedule is that it's consistent with other milestones you've seen in other year-long rate case proceedings. While no schedule is perfect, we endeavor to try and strike a reasonable balance. And we understand as a separate agenda item later today, you'll elicit feedback from the parties on this proposal. And we thank you for the chance to be able to submit this for your consideration. The second item I'd like to cover is the public hearing process. And we also talked about that in the August 5th joint filing with the EOE and the OCC. And what we said there was we think it's important to take into consideration concerns about geographic diversity, ability for the public to be able to access the forums. And so what we proposed for your consideration there would be 3 in-person public comment hearings and 1 virtual public comment hearing. To address the issue of geographic diversity, recognizing CLMP has 3 distinct geographic areas. We have Western, we have Central, and we have Eastern. We proposed the location of Danbury in the western part of our service territory, West Hartford for the central part of our service territory, and then for the east, we proposed either East Lyme or New London for your consideration. We're mindful of the concerns you voiced about securing venues. We recognize you can't control all the venues. It's an effort to work with affected towns to find a location. But to the extent you have the ability to do so, we'd ask you to please consider selecting locations that have ample parking and are sufficient in size, like, for example, a school auditorium or other larger facility to accommodate the public and ensure they have full and equal access to the venue. So we're happy to take any questions about those later in today's scheduling conference. The next item I'd like to talk about, and I think this is fairly standard, we'd like, consistent with prior practice, to reserve late file Exhibit 1 as the location where we can provide all rate case modifications, corrections, and updates. I think that's worked very well procedurally in prior rate cases. So just to be able to make that clear, we'd like to have late file 1 used for that purpose. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the issues of redactions for this docket. And just to make sure that I lay a foundation for this, as the stakeholders are aware, PURA did issue a procedural order, and that procedural order said there will be no confidentiality given to on a blanket basis for bulk documents. And so once we received that ruling, we did not protest it. We immediately shifted to focusing on how can we achieve compliance in the most efficient way possible, but also making sure that we do it correctly and accurately to make sure confidential information is protected. And so as a result of that, we submitted motion number 9. What motion number 9 said was the confidential data falls into 4 categories, and we hired a team, a cross-functional team, to work on those redactions. That team is comprised of attorneys, paralegals, in-house personnel, and we also supplemented our team with the Military Spouse Program. That's a national program whereby attorneys whose spouses are on active duty, they're also looking for legal work and they can perform redactions. So we've added them to our team to ensure we have a fairly large team to be able to complete the redactions. Motion number 9 broke up the information into the following 4 categories, and I'll provide an update right now in terms of where we stand on redactions. So the first category was in CLMP ENV 3A, that's the exhibit number, and that was environmental remediation. Our motion said we're targeting completion by August 14th. That work is done, so we plan to file that information in the docket. We've completed all the necessary public redactions, and so we can go ahead and file those on a public basis, redacting out the confidential information. The second category we referred to is an exhibit CLMP REV REQ 4A, and that was information dealing with the poll attachment and poll make-ready process. In our motion number 9, we targeted a completion date for redactions of August 30th. I'm happy to report that redaction work is now completed. So we're ready to be able to submit that information, in a redacted public format. The third category, and before I talk about the third category, I think it's important to emphasize, although we live in an age of AI, we were not able to use AI for this purpose. These are not standard templates, so there's a lot of variation in the documents. So we had to use people and a manual process to be able to effectuate the redactions. So the third category was exhibit CLMP ACCT 2A, and that was invoices submitted by our vendors who supply labor and materials for storm restoration. In our motion number 9, we said we'll endeavor to complete that by September 15th, 2026. And we've made significant progress, but we need about 2 to 3 more weeks. And the reason for that is when we sent samples to the vendors, we saw that they over-redacted. So we course corrected. We sat down with them and said, you're redacting too much information. We can only redact what truly is confidential. And now we're working on that to make sure we have the right balance. And so again, we're targeting about 2 to 3 weeks to have that work completed. The last category, which is very sensitive, is in CLMP Additions 6, and that's the capital project documentation. So all the supporting information behind the completed infrastructure investments, including project authorization forms that contain CEII, or critical energy infrastructure information, diagrams about infrastructure on the system, information that says these are weaknesses in the system. And of course, that has to be protected, and we have to use a manual process. And that falls into really 4 categories, so 4 subcategories. We're happy to report 2 of those 4 categories. We project the work will be done within 2 weeks. But the last 2 categories, where we have to make sure we get it right, we have to make sure we only redact out the information that's truly critical to protect the system, we are estimating to have that done by mid-September. So my goal in walking through that was to tell you we take this very seriously. We understand you want us to produce information in a public redacted format. We have a cross-functional team working very hard to complete that. And we're actually ahead of the schedule we laid out in our motion number 9. So that completes the procedural topics that I intended to cover, and the team here is happy to take any questions if you have those for us. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you. I actually had one question. Just said, I don't know if it's a question about the presentation specifically or the joint correspondence, but it was just about the statute. I mean, the final decision, the proposed final decision date. So the correspondence, the joint correspondence and the presentation show the statutory deadline of June 29th, but the final decision 6 days before that. Is that just because that's a Wednesday? Like, was the assumption that we were going to issue it on a Wednesday?
From our perspective, yes. So that was, and again, this is a proposal for your consideration. We're putting it out there as a straw proposal that at least the OCC and the EOE and we felt was consistent with milestones you have in other decisions. We recognize ultimately you have the ability to make adjustments as you see appropriate, but that was the thought process, at least from our perspective, in terms of selecting that date because it's on a Wednesday.
Okay. I was just curious if so long as we meet the statutory deadline. Pura has held special meetings in the past on a Monday or Tuesday or whatever. Would anyone have an issue, at least today, if we issued a decision on like the 28th or something?
I can't speak for other parties, but we at CLMP have no objection to the authority using the time allotted by statute and issuing your decision on that date.
Okay. EOE and OCC,
We have no objections.
Okay. Thank you. Does anyone else have questions about the presentation specifically? Okay. I had a couple of, I think next on the agenda, we're talking about the joint correspondence, which had proposed dates from OCC, EOE, and the company. And Attorney Pace mentioned public hearings, and I appreciate that the consideration. We actually just had a stakeholder meeting yesterday with a lot of the same people here, and we kind of we covered some of the same ground. So I said there, I'll say again here, we at Pura have been trying to put some thought into rethinking how we schedule public comment hearings and where we schedule them. So there isn't really an established methodology as far as I'm aware right now. It's been sort of on an ad hoc case-by-case basis, but we've been kind of internally discussing putting more thought into things like where the most, trying to find places that are most easily accessible by the most number of customers, essentially, and what sort of methodology we should consider in doing that. So we saw in the correspondence the suggestions for Danbury, West Hartford, and then either New London or East Lyme, plus a virtual public comment hearing. So I guess my first question is, I heard Attorney Pace's sort of explanation, but can anyone speak to more specifically to like the methodology that was considered and how those particular towns were arrived at to be suggested?
I'm afraid my answer is going to be unsatisfactory in the sense that it was East, Central, or the other direction, East, Central, West.
Okay, but like
To
for instance,
space it out amongst the state.
okay. I mean, just to say out loud, just speaking for myself, and no offense to those of us, there are many of us who live in West Hartford, but that's like one of the wealthiest towns in central Connecticut. Like, why not New Britain or Hartford or?
We were also trying to think about venues where you could, I mean, any of those would work, but you need a place where you can access a large auditorium. We are presuming that these will be well attended. So you need some sort of space, which is why we were thinking of schools, where you have an auditorium or something like that, and you have an abundance of free parking right beside it. So, but if New Britain works, equally good.
And I would say also for CLMP, we would have no objection if the authority were to say, based on a variety of factors, you felt the more appropriate venue for Central would be New Britain. I think that's a very good choice also, and we're supportive of that.
Okay. And I mean, I was just asking because, like I said, we've internally been discussing this. We were like, oh, maybe they've come up with some methodology. So still a work in progress for all of us, maybe. The correspondent says either New London or East Lyme. I was just curious, like which of those, like why we've got kind of 2.5, like why folks couldn't solidify that last one as between East Lyme or New London.
I can point out that the reason why we offered New London for consideration would be that it's still in the eastern part of the state, a larger area, a more diverse population, easily accessible by highway. And so at least as a point for you to consider. And really, again, the goal was to offer a menu for you to consider, but we recognize ultimately the 5 of you will decide what venues you think are appropriate. It was just a starting point for the conversation to at least have you start to think about those as potentials. But again, we are flexible in terms of deferring to your judgment on the ultimate locations.
As is OCC, and we also welcome other stakeholder input on desired locations as well.
Okay. Thanks. One thing that came up and I should have been clear, the stakeholder meeting we had yesterday wasn't about this docket. It was a general meeting among common stakeholders at PURA about rate cases and generally. But one of the things that came up from OCC was kind of throwing out there the suggestion about the timing, the actual time of day that the public comment hearings happen. The last couple of years, they've been scheduled for 5:30 p.m. There was a suggestion that maybe later would be better. It'd be easier for people to kind of get back from work, et cetera. Does anyone here have any suggestions for like times of day we should consider in scheduling these?
I'll just say that from the applicant's perspective, we recognize we have the burden of proof, and we want to make sure that the venue and the timing you select are open and accessible. And so if the authority decides you'd like to have it later in the evening, we would support that. We will make ourselves available at whatever time the authority determines is the right time to hold the public hearings.
Thank you. And I'll just add, following up on the conversation we had yesterday, I would suggest maybe a menu of all of the above, trying one in person in the later time and seeing how that works and whether it produces more people preserving one at 5:30. There are, the people that can get there after work and the people that need to be home to put their kids to bed at 8 o'clock. So offering both options seems to provide the best avenue for the most people to participate. Similarly, we had the same discussion around virtual meetings, which I think would be important to offer more than one, one at the usual lunchtime that PURA has historically offered in recent years, as well as a virtual hearing in the evening hours to allow others to participate.
We actually like those suggestions. We had not heard that before, but if we're going to have 3 in-person meetings, having them at different times may be a really great idea to test out the theory of what time works best for the most customers, especially since we assume these public comment hearings will be well attended regardless. It'll be a nice test, including having at least 2 virtual meetings and 1 in the afternoon. EOE supports that.
Thank you. I also should have said at the outset, anyone who isn't sitting up here but is a recognized intervener in the case, you can come. If you want to jump in, you can just come up to the microphone and I'll recognize you. My last question on this was getting back to Attorney Pace. You mentioned I think my reference yesterday to the difficulty we faced in the past in actually like finding these venues. Does anyone have any place in mind in any of these 4 towns specifically that, like any suggestions for where, like a particular school or a particular auditorium or?
I think we're very happy to help with that. And so what we can do is a homework assignment, we can huddle with the team afterwards and we can provide that information to the authority in terms of we're happy to do some work in helping to secure suitable venues that allow for full public access, including for disabled access, and have appropriate setup. So we can report back to you with some further information on that, if that's helpful to you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have questions about public comment hearings? Okay. I had some questions about briefing. So on footnote 2 on page 2 of the joint correspondence, it pertains to reply brief. And it looks like there's some disagreement between at least Eversource, OCC, and EOE about reply briefs. And the footnote says, at this time, OCC, EOE, and CLMP do not advance any specific legal arguments on this issue. I guess my first reaction was like, well, what time did you plan to advance legal arguments on the issue of scheduling reply briefs other than the scheduling conference?
I'll offer the CLMP perspective, but I'd like EOE and OCC to please offer their views. I think the intent there was that if the authority grants CLMP's request for a reply brief, that they consent to that being the date, but they're not acquiescing to the need for a reply brief. From our perspective, we feel that in a contested case, perhaps the most important case for a utility company, that a reply brief is both necessary and appropriate. I think we need look no further than the recent storm proceeding that CLMP had, which was Docket 25-12-13, where, in our view, a reply brief was critical because we saw for the very first time arguments, and also, in my view, arguments that really approached the creation or attempted creation of evidence for the very first time in a brief. And a reply brief allowed a participant a chance to be able to respond to that in a way that we thought is helpful to the commissioners and the authority when you're trying to sift through the various competing positions and develop a proposed final decision. So a reply brief provides all parties and interveners with the opportunity to be able to respond to issues appearing for the very first time in a brief. And therefore, that most recent proceeding demonstrates the critical value of having a reply brief. But I'll allow EOE and OCC to offer their respective views on that.
Thank you, Attorney Pace, and thank you, Commissioners. You know, I think we've briefed this in motion practice and a number of other dockets recently when there has been a question of whether reply briefing was appropriate. So I think that's, like Vincent mentioned, that footnote was really just a reference to that sort of ongoing philosophical administrative law disagreement that's been percolating throughout various dockets. But at the end of the day, PURA is the master of the schedule in this proceeding. And if you guys decide to order reply briefs, they will be in the schedule. So.
Similar with EOE, we do not believe that it is statutorily required under the UAPA. However, if the authority orders reply briefs, then EOE will support that.
Is it oral argument an opportunity to reply to briefs?
It is an opportunity to reply to a draft decision and written exceptions, but we think that comes very late in the process. And we feel that from a timing perspective, timing is key. And to wait until oral argument at the very end of the process, once we've seen a draft decision, and all due respect, is too late. We think that it adds more value to the commissioners, the staff, the other parties, and also is more consistent with due process to provide us with a chance to be able to identify concerns we have that are raised oftentimes for the very first time in a brief through a reply brief. And I've heard feedback, I believe from the commissioners in prior proceedings, that you don't want the reply brief to be used as a vehicle to restate your prior points. And we understand that. So our focus would be to use the reply brief in a very targeted way to respond to the key arguments that we're seeing in those briefs, in particular when there are issues being raised for the very first time. So, and again, I'll point back to the storm docket where we saw issues being raised and alleged new evidence being offered for the very first time in a brief. A reply brief is an effective tool to allow counsel to be able to respond to that, before the authority sits down and deliberates on the content of your draft decision. So for that reason, respectfully, we think the reply brief is critically important, it adds value, and parties should use them strategically. Again, not to restate or rehash things we've said before, but to be targeted, to respond to key points being made in the other side's briefs.
I'll try to project instead of leaning across the table here. Jay Goodman for CIEC. Briefly, we would strongly support the inclusion of an opportunity for reply briefs for the reasons explained by Attorney Pace. We think that it's an important opportunity to respond to arguments that parties will see for the first time. And, as to oral arguments, understand, could potentially respond to those arguments at that time, but review oral arguments more is intended as an opportunity to address proposed decisions and the rationale advanced by the authority itself in the draft decision, as opposed to prior positions advanced by the parties and interveners. But the bottom line is although we don't have a position per se on the specific dates proposed in the joint schedule that was filed, do strongly support the inclusion of an opportunity for reply briefs. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Well, just to respond to that, I would respectfully disagree with our colleague, Attorney Goodman. I think what's missing in this discussion of the process is the fact that there are evidentiary hearings, there's pre-filed testimony, there's an ability for the company to incorporate arguments and positions that it has heard throughout the case into its opening briefing. And that combined with the opportunity for oral argument and exceptions does cover the statutorily required due process that is afforded. I would also like to note, we disagree with the representation that the storm briefing had new evidence. It had compilations of Eversource's evidence that it produced in the case. And that is something that we view briefs as an important opportunity to compile and synthesize all of the evidence that we've heard throughout the proceeding, but it's not new evidence because it's organized and compiled in a way that we feel is beneficial for the authority to review.
Chair, if I could just make one more point too, and that is, again, in all due respect from what we've seen, oftentimes while parties can put on evidence and offer positions, those are not crystallized. You don't actually understand what their final position is until you actually see the brief. And that's why the reply brief, in my view, is so critically important to allow a response to that before the agency goes and deliberates on your proposed final decision. I'll also point out, going back to the storm docket, which is it also helps narrow the issues, which drives efficiency. So for example, in the storm docket 25-12-13, once we saw positions taken by parties in their briefs, we made some concessions and said, you know what, we agree with that, and we take the issue off the table. That produces efficiency. That's 1 or 2 or 3 less issues the agency has to deliberate on. So that's another reason why a reply brief can add value, because we may say, you know what, we agree, or we can do those types of things. And that helps narrow the scope of open issues an agency has to adjudicate. So thank you for that chance to respond.
Sure. Sorry. Thank you, Chair Will. I'll be brief. Just want to agree with that point that we see that initial post-hearing brief is really the first time the parties are synthesizing positions that may have been advanced in testimony, information developed through discovery, and cross-examination, and really synthesizes all that into the affirmative positions that the parties want to advance or potentially oppose in the case. And the reply brief is really the first time for parties to respond to those arguments. And we agree that it's a critical opportunity that provides important information for the authority to consider. Thank you.
Hopefully it'll be the last one. Although EOE understands the benefits that can be derived from a reply brief, the briefs are each party's legal arguments for the authority to contemplate in their overall review. It's not evidence, it has a different weighted standard for the authority's review. And parties don't necessarily have a right to know what each individual party's legal argument is prior to the brief. I do feel that oral arguments is a perfectly acceptable place to comment on those different legal arguments, but at the end of the day, they are still legal arguments for the authority to use if they choose to agree with them, or if they choose to see those arguments as they weigh the evidence as provided by the parties in the docket.
Attorney Bogan. We got to get like an easier switch on that thing. Like,
It's
you
okay.
have to take out like a multi-tool out of your pocket.
I'm going to weigh in here because I do believe it's an important procedural policy issue that's being discussed. I have to agree with Attorney Pace. Very often, you don't know what issues are deemed to be of import by other parties until you see it in their brief. Your reply brief is an opportunity to respond to those, number one. Number two, without attributing anything to anyone, sometimes there are mischaracterizations in a brief, and your reply is an opportunity to reframe that issue and correct it. And so therefore, with respect to the Vice Chairman's question, to relegate it to written exceptions, you're arguing already, you're swimming against the tide. The draft decision is already out there. Now you're trying to get the commission to reverse its position. So I'm not looking to add work for anyone, but I think it sets a dangerous policy precedent if you don't allow it.
On that second point, Attorney Bogan, not to pick on you, but what happens if there are mischaracterization in the reply brief? Should we have reply briefs and then triple reply briefs?
That's a fair point, because we've seen instances, and I've been a victim or a perpetrator of it myself, not in terms of mischaracterization, but when the schedule doesn't allow for a response to something, and therefore you want the opportunity to respond. So your point is well taken. I mean, where does it end? I can't answer that question, but I do believe it's appropriate policy to at least allow a reply brief.
Attorney Mikowski.
Just to tie a bow on all of this, the legislature, in its wisdom in enacting the UAPA, only allowed for briefs. Anything beyond that is discretionary. So I think everyone's positions are clear, and I would just once again state that, whether there's a reply brief or not is something that is at the authority's discretion. However, a brief alone satisfies the UAPA due process that the legislature saw fit to afford to parties in proceedings like this.
Thanks. I had sort of a utilitarian thought about this, which admittedly ignores folks like CIEC, who I now recognize may see some use to both the initial brief and the reply brief, but thinking only of, selfishly, only of OCC and the company, it seems to me practically that the company's initial brief, no offense to this company or any other, but is of relatively little value to the overall docket because it tends to basically just be a restatement of the entire application. Whereas OCC or EOE's initial brief, to Attorney Pace's point, adds a lot of value to everyone because it is oftentimes the first time that anyone sort of sees the crystallization of those parties' positions. I'll also just throw out there, not to be argumentative, but I don't know that it, not to pick on the Attorney General's office, but as far as I know, they've never put on witnesses in any rate case, but I think we still value I don't know that, the idea that people have to put on evidence in a rate case in order to have standing or whatever. I'm not sure how much I understand that, but I think the folks who don't maybe engage at the same level as maybe OCC and EOE, it's still really valuable to sort of see where they are coming from their initial brief. But then anyway, conversely, I think the company's reply brief can be, for lack of a better word, relatively valuable in adding sort of new ideas to the proceeding, whereas having written several myself, the reply brief of OCC and EOE is oftentimes kind of like, no, yeah, like we said in our initial brief, that's what we think. So I wonder, just throwing out there, what if we just had one brief, but we staggered the timing, that there was a brief first due for interveners and parties, and then a company brief due after that? I imagine, not to speak for Attorney Goodman, that wouldn't be so great for parties who want to be able to potentially, respond, for instance, to OCC and also file an initial brief. But I'm just sort of throwing it out there as an idea.
I conferred with my colleague, Attorney Kimball, and Eversource would have no objection to that approach because we do agree with your assessment, and that is the initial brief that we see from, for example, OCC and AG and EOE and DEEP and others is often the very first time that we see crystallized the various issues that they've examined and focused on during the proceeding, and we see actually what their proposed disallowance or modification is going to be. And if it's helpful for us not to file an initial brief and to limit our response to a reply brief, we're supportive of that approach because we do agree with your observations that we're really seeing oftentimes for the first time their positions in a brief. And in particular, you identify there's a subset of docket participants who put on no affirmative case, who produced no witnesses, and we find out what their actual position is for the very first time in their brief. And so if that adds value to the commissioners and to the staff, we're happy to structure it that way so that the work product you see from us is a response to their initial work product, but we'll allow for others to react to your proposal.
Any, Consumer Counsel, or Attorney Minikowski.
Thank you, Chairman. I think my initial sort of reservation to that is different parties receiving different processes, whereas every party to an administrative proceeding should be receiving the same process. And also Attorney Goodman and Attorney Bogan have raised their perspectives on reply briefing this morning, and I don't think a staggered briefing schedule would address those particular concerns that those parties raised as well.
To your first point, how is it different from the staggering of testimonies? Like, there's the company files testimony first, and then parties like OCC can file testimony, and then there's reply test. I mean, that's a different process under the UAPA, right?
No, that's not even in the UAPA.
But so is that also objectionable then? The fact that, like, would OCC prefer to just file testimony on the same date the application is filed?
No. But the company bears the burden of proof to come forward with its application supporting documentation. I mean, pre-filed testimony and the way we do this, that's entirely a creature of PURA. That's not reflected in the UAPA in any form whatsoever.
Yeah, I agree. I'm struggling to understand like why it's objectionable to have a staggered process with briefs. I mean, to be blunt, OCC wants the chance to respond to the application via testimony, just like the company wants a chance to respond to OCC via briefs. Like, I'm not sure I understand like why one feels okay and the other doesn't.
Well, the problem is that briefing is the legal hook that's in the UAPA. I mean, that's explicitly in 4-179A as the right that parties are entitled to in a proceeding. So I think if you have different parties on a different, for instance, like would one party get more time than another party based on the staggering, that could lead to a differential outcome and a potential allegation of prejudice if potentially the docket didn't go away and a particular party wanted. Like I said, it's just a reservation that comes to mind, and I think is worth thinking about.
Just to add on the difference between, the pre-filed testimony and the brief, the non-company parties need to understand the scope of the evidence being provided by the company before we could provide our own evidence. So it would be near impossible. We would just be guessing if we were required to submit pre-filed testimony the same time the company was, especially since we don't always know exactly what day that may be.
Thank you. Chairilla, I or someone I think said earlier that the proposal may not satisfy the concerns of CIC, and that's correct. I think for us, it's important to not just be able to file the initial brief, but it can be difficult to fully anticipate what positions other parties will advance, or even if we anticipated an argument, to fully foresee how the argument will be presented. And I think that reply brief, one, it should be more limited in scope than the initial brief, but it really is an important opportunity to provide a more focused response if you didn't fully anticipate an argument or even anticipate it at all. but it helps to further develop the record on issues of importance to the parties, like CIEC. So understanding that there may not be, frankly, haven't researched whether there's a statutory requirement or not, but taking, Attorney Minikowski's representation that there's no statutory requirement for the reply brief, given that it's within the authority's discretion, we still think that it serves a very important procedural role to help develop the record of the proceeding and to give all parties the full opportunity to respond to arguments that they may not have seen before or fully appreciated the scope and nuance of prior to filing an initial brief.
Thank you. Not to belabor this further, but just to round out the discussion, Chair Wheel, I definitely agree with your assessment of sort of the value of different briefing at different times. However, a staggered briefing schedule seems to be to a great advantage of Eversource. It allows them to do less work and get the last say. And I think our preference, if you're going to allow for reply briefs, would be to maintain the usual course where all parties submit briefs at the same time. That allows us the opportunity to at least evaluate the positions articulated by the company and to file our own reply brief should we see fit.
And just to add EOE's perspective on the staggered briefing schedule, I was hoping OCC would explain their position more eloquently than I was going to be able to. So just for the record, I do agree with what OCC stated.
Attorney Cherry.
Hi. I just had one thing I wanted to sort of bring us back to, and this was raised by Eversource at the beginning of this whole discussion. It seemed like one of the main concerns was about evidence being raised for the first time and how to deal with that, basically. So I don't know exactly what the solution is here, but I just wanted to kind of refocus on that issue a little bit, because if you can solve that, then I think that solves 90% of the concern over this, is how to come up with a fair way to determine, I guess, if new evidence has shown up in a brief. And I'm not speaking from any experience at all. I know this is the first time most of you have seen me in probably like 4 or 5 years. So, but that seems like the key concern. I don't want to put words in Eversource's mouth, but I think we got away from that a little bit. If there's a way to figure that out, I think you can solve this.
All right. Thank you. I'm getting the sense that I'm boring my non-lawyer friends on the bench up here, so I'm gonna move on. Although I have a related topic next, which is oral arguments. So I saw from the joint proposed schedule that, in keeping with every rate case for the last decade or more, the proposal is to have oral arguments after the issuance of a proposed final decision, well, after the receipt of exceptions after that. And this is going to be no surprise to some folks in this room, because I made comments during oral arguments in the Eversource Storm docket about this. I just kind of wanted to throw out there for discussion again, and this sort of relates to some of what we just discussed and the question I think Commissioner Aconti had about oral arguments and the timing that Attorney Pace raised. But it seems to me that oral arguments scheduled in the position in the procedural schedule where they traditionally are happen kind of late, partially because I would like to use oral arguments as a chance to actually engage in discussions, and I think all of my fellow commissioners agree. It's sort of our first chance sitting up here to actually enter the discussion that happens over the course of a case. And it can be a frustrating posture to enter that discussion after we've already sort of issued a proposed final decision. So we did have one docket, I don't remember the docket number off the top of my head, but it was the RWA Aquarian change of control docket, where oral arguments were scheduled after briefs instead of after exceptions. So I wanted to throw out there what people would think of a schedule that looked like that allowed opportunity for arguments after the filing of briefs, so that it would be full transparency. It would be more helpful to me, at least as a commissioner, to kind of be able to read your briefs talk to you, make sure I understand where you're coming from before we sit down and draft the proposed final decision. So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Could I ask a clarifying question on that proposal? And that would be, would the authority still contemplate if you were to add that additional step where after briefing, you would have the attorneys come in, you could ask us questions? Would you still contemplate providing oral argument at the very end before you go to a final decision? So there would be two opportunities? And if that were to be the case, at least speaking for CLMP, we're supportive of that because we think ultimately, what's the job of an advocate? It's to ensure the decision maker has the information they need to make an informed decision. And if we as attorneys can do that by having an extra oral argument after the briefing, then I think we've all achieved our goal of making sure we get you the information you need to make an informed decision and deliberate. So we're supportive of adding that additional step to the process. You tell us when it's helpful to you, we'll make ourselves available to answer your questions before you issue a draft decision.
Would the company or parties view that as an alternative to written exceptions? In other words, an initial oral argument opportunity?
Thanks. I think it's a little bit maybe mixing things up a little bit. I think the idea is to get to a clear and clean last decision that would be, everybody would love if there was no motions for reconsideration, no appeals, right? The best, everybody might not like it, but it's clear of mistakes, it's clear of maybe policy decisions where the evidence hasn't been brought forward. So I don't really see them as substitutes for each other. I think the benefit of doing the oral argument, I think although we were so appreciative of the oral argument on storms, a little bit the problem is of doing it after draft decision is the record's closed. So when you have, I think it's confusing to have SMEs or non-lawyers at the oral argument because it's so confusing to the record. So whereas if the commission is interested in some more open discourse and probably not with like silly lawyers, but maybe with actually people that know stuff, then that would need to happen before the draft decision, like maybe even before the record's closed, so that you wouldn't be mixing up kind of like new evidence with oral argument.
Yeah, and excuse me, I actually misspoke. I actually meant as an alternative to reply briefs.
Oh, okay. So
I
sorry.
apologize. Too many steps. And that's what we're trying to address. So that would be that opportunity to reply in the room or, and then later on, we would still.
I think so. I think that it would be something to consider if you're saying we do oral replies instead of written replies. I think that, yes.
I'm just throwing that out to the mix.
Yes,
for folks
that I
to
could see, not after, but mixing up like before the record's closed and after the record's closed. Yeah.
Understood.
Okay.
But I mean, to your other point, I mean, if there is an egregious mistake, the authority can also correct a mistake with or without even a proposed final, right? We can actually,
Correct.
we have means of doing that
Correct.
legally.
I think the idea is to just get the best information as early in the process as helpful to people. Like that's totally, everybody should be on board with that.
Thank you.
Okay, and just to clarify for the record, so the proposition that we're asking for stakeholder input, you're asking for stakeholder input would be in lieu of having a written reply brief, are the parties amenable to appearing in front of the commission to answer your questions and also offer some verbal response to briefs? And we would support that process because it achieves the same goal, which is instead of doing it in writing, we're doing it verbally in terms of communicating our position. And also, more importantly, hearing from you, finding out what's important to you, what you're still struggling with, and giving you our perspective on it, and also hearing from others. So we have no objection to that approach, but I realize others want to comment on that.
As EOE's position that the reply brief is largely optional, discretionary to the authority, we wouldn't object if that is what the authority would prefer to do. Just two concerns under the UAPA: when there's a proposed final decision or when a proposed final decision is required, an oral argument is still required. And I do believe your proposal was not to have the first oral argument in lieu of the second one. But I did want to highlight that. And I also want to make sure We understand if this oral argument is after the hearings and late file hearings, new evidence still should not be provided because then parties wouldn't really have an opportunity to cross on that evidence. It's still an oral argument. It's still supposed to be a legal discussion.
If I just take advantage of the microphone.
Yeah, go ahead.
The telephone.
Fly across the.
Thanks. Sorry, so briefly, I'll start by saying that, not every jurisdiction has opportunities for oral arguments to the authority or opportunities such as this hearing or technical meetings or, other procedural mechanisms to actually have a discussion with the authority. We think that those opportunities are really a strength of the regulatory system here in Connecticut, especially in a rate case, to ensure that, to the extent that there are questions or clarifications that, could be helpful for the authority. That's a good opportunity. That said, we still would not support oral arguments in lieu of written reply brief or exceptions. We still think that the opportunity to have more time to prepare a position, to research and support and articulate a position in writing through a reply brief is, in our perspective, preferable to, simply relying on the oral arguments. So if it would be a choice between the two, we would prefer the written reply brief.
I was just going to follow up, Commissioners, actually to items that both Attorney Wyman and Attorney Goodman mentioned. If the commission does decide to go that route, we just have to recognize that, yeah, we're going to have two oral arguments because the UAPA statute of the day, 4-179A, requires oral argument if there is a proposed final decision and someone requests it. So that would just be an additional step in the process if PURA does decide to hold a discretionary oral argument post-briefing or post-hearing. Then Attorney Goodman just, yeah, and then I was going to follow up on something Attorney Goodman just said. In terms of having sort of a discretionary oral argument in lieu of reply briefing, the one reservation I would express about that is, an attorney is on their feet in front of the commission. They say, I know there's this case out there that's similar to what we're dealing with here. You can't remember it, and boom, there's your opportunity. It's gone. Whereas with a reply brief, there is the opportunity to do that additional research and present something in writing with all the citations and references that could guide the authority in its decision making. So that would just be something to take into consideration as well from the authority's standpoint.
Thanks. That's actually your first point, Attorney Minkowski. It's a good transition into the next area I wanted to talk about, which is 4-179 and proposed final decisions. As most lawyers in this room, at least who practice here, are probably aware, that's a discretionary requirement only where the majority of commissioners haven't heard the matter or read the record. And as people know, like PURA has consistently issued proposed final decisions anyway, even where that condition isn't met. I also kind of vented about this during the storm oral argument about my distaste for PFDs, at least with respect to the mixed signals they seem to send. Again, like I said there, a proposed final decision isn't a decision. It doesn't represent the majority. It doesn't necessarily represent the majority views of the commissioners, but it's because it's formatted like a final order. Folks both in the proceeding and frankly in real life and in the press seem to, I'm so tired of seeing headlines saying PURA has approved or not approved X based on a PFD. Like we haven't approved or not approved anything when a PFD is issued. And I do wonder, I guess my question is, isn't a petition for reconsideration under 4-181A, which explicitly says it's the purpose of it, at least as I view it, is to identify errors, seek changes for any good cause. Like, isn't that the legislature's, isn't that the better vehicle to be doing what people have been using exceptions for? Like, why, unless we need to issue a proposed final decision, why do we need to do that? And what kind of interests or rights would people lose given the fact that they could always file a petition for reconsideration?
Thank you, Chair Wheel. You're staring right at me, so I'll just follow this. You're locked in. Yeah, so this is something I've long philosophically opined upon, is that PURA just uses its discretion to issue proposed final decisions in many cases where it is not statutorily required to do so. If you look at other administrative agencies' decision-making, it's far more common for those decisions to go straight to a final decision and everyone sees it for the first time, whether you like it or not. But I think PURA has instituted a good practice with the proposed final decisions, even though there are, often it can be confusing to the public or the press or policymakers, because it does allow that opportunity for course correction by the parties that would otherwise have to come in the form of a motion for reconsideration, or a petition for reconsideration rather, which is a sort of a more onerous, confined legal vehicle, to correct an issue of law or fact. There's sort of a more narrow route for advocacy in the petition for reconsideration avenue, just because of the legal standard, whereas the written exceptions allow for a broader policy discussion by the parties in response to the indications and the signals that the authority is given in the proposed final decision. I think the trade-off too, that the authority should be mindful of, is that if if we skip the proposed final decisions in cases where they don't legally need to be issued but are issued discretionary under PURA's discretion, I think the opportunity and perhaps the inevitability of administrative appeals increases, because parties get a final decision, they're seeing an issue they don't like for the first time. They try the petition for reconsideration route under that more narrow legal standard. They don't get a result that is in accord with their own viewpoints. And I think the likelihood that parties will take the matter across the way to the courthouse is a little more likely. So that, that is one policy consideration to consider as well. And I think the use of discretionary proposed final decisions and written exceptions and oral argument helps to resolve those issues in advance, so that the authority has the opportunity to take into consideration the positions of the party and course correct and have that in mind before it does issue its final. But I do agree, the PURA has for many years now made it a practice of issuing proposed final decisions in cases where it doesn't need to, but I think the parties have generally been well served by that practice.
I wanted to express my agreement with Attorney Minikowski for the points that he made, and I do think there is benefit to all stakeholders with the agency issuing a proposed final decision. I do hear the concern you're voicing as a chairperson of an agency in terms of how the media may react to a draft decision, because we all recognize here in this room, it is just a draft decision. It's not the agency's final decision. But we think that Attorney Minikowski did a very nice job of identifying the longstanding benefits offered by issuing a proposed final decision. And if the agency were to conclude that, based on your reading of 4-179 subsection A, if all the commissioners were to read the entire record and forego a proposed final decision and go straight to final decision, we think then what you're going to see is many, many more petitions for reconsideration being filed. I think the practice to date is petitions for reconsideration are used very sparingly, and they're on very narrow issues. If we now eliminate a proposed final decision and go straight to final decisions, I think the practice you're going to see is many attorneys will be using a petition for reconsideration to essentially raise all the concerns they have with the final decision, and now the frequency of those and the scope of those will be amplified. They'll be much more significant. And so ultimately, we think this longstanding practice makes sense, and it provides you with a final chance to hear feedback from parties. And oftentimes, when a draft decision comes out, you do have discussion between parties in terms of, are there solutions they can work out to issues, and they can communicate that either in written exceptions or an oral argument, and those opportunities would now be foregone if you went straight to a final decision. So we'd like you to please take that into consideration when you deliberate over the issue that you raised. Thank you.
Thanks. I just have two quick. First, you said all commissioners the majority has to read the record, but doesn't it say heard the matter or read the entire record? Isn't that what the statute says?
You are correct, and I'll read it for the record. It says, when in an agency proceeding, a majority of the members of the agency who are to render the final decision have not heard the matter or read the record, the decision, if adverse to a party, shall not be rendered until a proposed final decision is served upon the parties and an opportunity is afforded to each party adversely affected to file exceptions and present briefs, and oral argument to the members of the agency who are to render the final decision. So ultimately, what I was just pointing out there, and I appreciate the chance to clarify, would be that if you conclude, based on the way the commissioners on this panel will be processing the information in this docket, that you're not required to issue a proposed final decision, we think that that would bring along the consequences we talked about, which would be you're going to be having a lot more significant issues being raised in a petition for reconsideration. So the work essentially is being pushed into the petition for reconsideration, and it'll have to be addressed there.
Yeah, and that was the other question I had is like, but conversely, we'd have less work because we'd have no exceptions. So wouldn't it just be the same work that we do in processing exceptions just via petitions for reconsideration? Like, why is that a bad thing? Okay, yeah, I agree. We'd probably get a motion for reconsideration in every case, but why is that? Why should we view that as a negative?
Well, at least we view it as a negative. I'll let other parties offer their own viewpoints because it, takes away, in my view, some of the opportunities to work to see if we can resolve issues through discussions offline and presentations of that in our written exceptions and also in our oral arguments. So at least it eliminates that opportunity from the process. But of course, others can add their thoughts to that.
One thing I wanted to follow up on to keep in mind is we're discussing shifting written exceptions material to petition for reconsideration material, but also let's not forget, the party doesn't need to file a petition for reconsideration to file an administrative appeal. So a lot of these issues might not even be addressed before PURA. It might go right before a judge. And I think at that point, PURA will have missed a valuable opportunity to potentially reconsider and re-examine parts of his decision before it ends up in front of a decision maker who might render a decision that no one likes, via a judicial opinion and subsequent appellate litigation. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as well.
Anyone else have anything on?
Okay. So I guess my question, I'm not really expecting an answer. It's more rhetorical, but earlier in the scheduling conference, there was discussion around reply briefs and fairness and, the ability for parties to respond to mischaracterization of legal arguments. So I've, over the years, have seen mischaracterizations, in the press and social media outlets and videos during the gap between PFD and final decision times. And when the authority is asked for comment, we can't comment because we're adjudicating the case. So again, my question is kind of rhetorical. Just also kind of looking to fairness to the authority and the panel and the sort of reputation of the authority as well. So not necessarily looking for comment or not really a question, just internal thought. If the parties want to agree to a gag order between PFD and FDs, I would entertain that, but again, you can respond or not, I feel like I needed to say that.
Attorney Pace. Oh, were you turning that off? Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. The next topic I had, Attorney Pace, you mentioned this in the beginning, which is motion number 9. So Eversource via motion number 9 had asked for the authority to approve a procedural schedule for the with some filing dates as Attorney Pace went over with sort of the touchstones of the remaining documents that need to be redacted. And OCC filed a response to that motion, and I don't want to put words in OCC's mouth, so correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but my understanding of the response, although it wasn't framed as an objection per se, was that the concern OCC, as I understand it, is facing right now is that as you're issuing discovery on the confidential exhibits that you already have, you're having to decide what is disclosed or not via your own questions. So without the kind of fully redacted documents in the proceeding, you don't know what you can or can't ask. And it's my understanding you've chosen to just not specifically disclose the dollar figures, I think, on what you have so far. So the presiding officer, that's me, denied Eversource's motion, although we didn't flat out deny it. We said basically we want to discuss this at the scheduling conference. And that was the intent of that ruling, was just sort of, that was my thought process. We're having a scheduling conference coming up. There's a scheduling question. It sounds like OCC may want to be heard further on this. So I just wanted to throw out that there for discussion, because this is an open question. We recognize there's still this open question of when are these redacted documents supposed to be filed as we put together the procedural schedule. So did OCC or any other party want to be heard specifically on the proposed dates from Eversource via motion number 9? I can read them out loud if that's helpful.
Sorry. So this is multifaceted, so I'm going to only deal with the first part of it here, but I'm going to call out to your attention that we also have the other aspect that we discussed. And so a lot of this regards the storm invoices. I know there are other invoices that are there other documents that are going to be filed in a redacted format. So regarding the redactions, what you stated conveys our point accurately. We have to make decisions as to what we include in interrogatories without having the benefit of the redacted information already in front of us. So we're making our best guess. If that's acceptable to Eversource, we're doing our best we can right now, and that's the method we're proceeding with. I think the other topic, which I'm not certain is part of this topic, and maybe you're going to get to this later, is the lack of information in the record at this moment. That's kind of a different topic that affects quite a bit of the discovery and other things here. So I don't know if that's what you're alluding to now, or if you're just talking about the redactions at the moment.
That's next on that's Vice Chairman Arconti's topic, I think, is next on the list.
Okay, well then regarding the redactions, we are currently trying to proceed as best we can. We've said what we're going to do in this. We have concerns, as we've expressed otherwise in our other filings too, about the legality of making bulk confidential filings and not having that information on the record, but it sounds as if it's eventually getting in the record. So it looks as if EOE wishes to respond.
I do understand that I am slightly jumping into the next topic, but EOE questions the completeness of an application of which all of the required publicly filed documents have not yet been filed.
Okay, we are going to get to we did see the correspondence about the completeness of the application, and that is another topic we're going to get to next. I think I was sort of more practically trying to figure out, again, we've got this proposal from Eversource about these dates by which the company can submit the redacted documents. I guess like the most kind of nuts and bolts question I have is there's this proposal for hearings to start on January 11th, according to the joint correspondence. Eversource's last deadline to file CLP Edition 6 is October 1st. So viewing this purely as a former rate case participant myself, that gives OCC and every other party from October 1st to January 11th to issue any discovery that, for whatever reason, needed to wait until the redacted documents were actually provided. I don't know whether that's even an issue, but does that work? And is there anything else that we should take into consideration these sorts of redaction dates, setting aside the next topic of the completeness argument?
So we also would factor in, though, the PFT, at least according to the proposed schedule, is due on October 21st. So I'm not sure the turnaround between the last redaction and the PFT filing allows for the discovery response to be, or allows for everything to be fully redacted in that timeframe. So that's something worth considering.
Yeah, Chairman.
And I'd just add to Attorney White's comment that we're already, with the proposed schedule, under an extremely tight timeline to issue discovery requests and get the information we need to be able to file the PFDs. In fact, we view the schedule that we've tentatively agreed to as provisional with the assumption that we will get discovery in a timely manner. If we're getting a lot of extensions and delays on that, we're not going to be able to meet that PFD deadline. And similarly, if there are limitations to the ability to issue interrogatories that we need for our PFD or other discovery that's still pending, we will reserve the right to update our pre-filed testimony either through additional written or through, at the hearings, because when we need to have a complete set of evidence to be able to fairly evaluate and draw conclusions. If we don't have that, we can't do our job.
Chair Will, I'd like the chance to reply if I could. I think the first thing I'd like to respond to is I heard from the speakers now, we need complete information. I do think it bears emphasis that on July 14th, which is the day we filed the application, participants had 100% access to all the information. It was filed in a confidential format, but they have access to it. So they can develop their positions, they can develop their reactions, because they are currently and have been since July 14th in possession of the information. So the narrow issue that's being talked about is, if a member of the public wants to see public redacted versions of the information that OCC and others already have access to, when will that be posted on the website? Now, the other concern I'm hearing is, at least the allegation is, it's putting a barrier or limitation on their ability to be able to articulate their discovery questions. What I'd remind the parties about is, in the recent docket we had in 25-12-13, we received about 1,700 interrogatory questions, and all the storm invoices were filed on a bulk confidential basis. And with the attorneys who are sophisticated that we have here in this room, they were able to articulate all those questions and be able to get to the concerns they have and describe what they were. So there is a way that we can deal with this. We also have offered, in addition to that, we've said, up until the time we get you, for example, the storm invoices in a public redacted format, which I've said are about 2 to 3 weeks away, if you have specific invoices that you need to see put on the website earlier in a public redacted format, we're going to work with you and get you the information sooner. So I just think that's helpful context to understand the specific request that we're hearing from the OCC. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to ask along. I just want to make sure, again, I saw the OCC correspondence in response to motion number 9 wasn't an objection. I think I understood that. I guess what I'm trying to make sure I understand is it OCC's position that there's like a that you're hindered in some way, or there's some barrier for you to develop the discovery you need to develop because we don't have the fully redacted documents publicly available in the record yet?
No, we can develop our discovery. As I said, we're attempting to work with it in its current form.
Okay. And I'm sorry, Attorney Pace, I know I could go back and check this transcript later, but can you remind me is there an updated expectation for when the company's going to be able to file that last set, the capital additions set? It was that October 1st on motion number 9. I didn't know, I think you might have said earlier that you're ahead of schedule on that, but I couldn't.
Correct. So you're correct in pointing out that in motion number 9, we had put out as an initial target date, October 1st of 2026. And then what the team had reported to me is that particular tranche of documents are broken down into 4 categories or 4 sub-buckets. And in the first 2 subcategories, they're targeting to complete those within about 2 weeks from today. But then for the remaining 2 categories, which are much more challenging, they've said they'll be done in mid-September. So obviously, if things are ready sooner, we're going to make them available sooner. But the team understands from the commissioners how important the issue is. We hear from OCC how important the issue is. And so we have a team assembled, and they're working through it. But I'd remind people, again, we can't use automation or AI. This is a manual process. And so they're working through it and doing their best. And we're trying to have a very robust team work through all this documentation as quickly as they can, but also making sure they're accurate.
Okay. Does anyone else have questions or want to be heard on this topic? Okay. Next, I did want to address, like I said before, we saw the correspondence from EOE and OCC regarding the completeness of applications. Vice Chairman Arcanti, did you want to?
I guess I just wanted to give OCC and EOE an opportunity to expand on the correspondence today. And also if there was an action, the OCC and EOE were looking for the authority to take, because I noticed it was filed as correspondence. So I just wanted to give that opportunity today to hear a little bit more.
Hot potato on the mic in response to this one. I think we filed it as correspondence because, to be honest, we weren't completely clear of the authority's intentions with respect to declaring the application complete and the triggering of the statutory clock, and we wanted to preserve our rights in case the authority was also still deliberating the completeness of the application. We wanted to proceed with our discovery and work with the company on a schedule and be efficient in the utilizing the time we have. But we also didn't want to concede any legal ground to the extent the authority was still deliberating on the completeness of the application.
I don't think I have much to add to that. It was EOE's similar perspective. We were unsure coming into today, even if there was a full application or not in the perspective of the authority. We understand that Eversource did respond to our correspondence, and I believe, and I do not want to put words in Eversource's mouth, that it is the company's intent to not file those costs, anything after March. I appreciate you, Attorney Kibble, nodding for me. Anything after, any of the storm costs after March, that's also the test year. So he was unsure of how that ultimately affects anything, but as a Consumer Counsel much more eloquently stated than I am, I think we wanted to just sort of flag it as an issue for further authority consideration.
Yeah, if I could add on to that just a little bit. In our correspondence, we referred to two things. First off, as we said, we continue with the discussion that we're not positive that an application is complete when it's not filed publicly. However, we're going to set that aside for the second, and we're going to go into the more important matter, in my opinion, of whether or not the application is complete when it literally does not have all of the material available to review at this moment. And that was our primary concern. Now, part of that was regarding the storms. It sounds as if Eversource is saying that they're only going to file storms through March 2025. That equally branches off into other concerns of we're doing a 2025 test year and we only have, 1/4 of the storms available. We're not really certain what to do with that at this moment. And then on the other side, we've heard multiple things, as in the presentation earlier, in one of the pages of the presentation, they're going to be updating multiple filings throughout the proceeding. They give us several dates into the future. We don't necessarily have all of the material available at this moment to work with, it seems, from our perspective.
Chair Will, I'd like a chance to respond to at least the comment that was made about the scope of costs for which we're seeking recovery as it relates to storms. Just to be clear, I think the OCC said it sounds as if they're not seeking. Well, in our filing, we actually pointed to record evidence that says that the cutoff date that we're seeking to recover costs for prudently incurred catastrophic storms is March 31st, 2025. And that has no relationship whatsoever to the test year because, as the authority is aware, there's a special mechanism for catastrophic storms. When they exceed the trigger mechanism, they're booked to a reserve, and we're seeking recovery of those, in the venue of a rate case, but they're not part of our test year cost of service. They're in a separate reserve. And we've identified in the evidence we pointed to that, at least for this rate case, the cutoff date for our request to recover catastrophic storms booked to the reserve is March 31st, 2025. So there is no incompleteness. There is no missing information. That's the scope of our request. And those are the numbers baked into our revenue requirement. We're not looking to recover in this venue post March 31st, 2025 cost for catastrophic storms. What Attorney Kimball did clarify is to say that we have a proposal for a mechanism going into the future, but again, we're not seeking to actually, we're not submitting a request to recover specific storms beyond March 31st, 2025 that are catastrophic.
We would push back a little bit on it having no relation to the test year, as some of the costs, as we are reviewing the rest of the storms and whatever mechanism that may be, may have some relation to O&M. And there's a possibility of understating the storm costs that would have then offset the 2025 test year O&M.
Also, as I believe they alluded to, there are total 2025 costs that are underlying certain presumptions that are in the filing and that will be carrying forward. So we don't have all of those costs. They are presumed in this docket at the moment.
I think we'd like some additional clarification on that. I'm going to look to my clients. Are you aware of what Attorney White is referring to when she said there's some additional incomplete information they're looking for? So if we could have OCC, if it's acceptable to the commissioners, we can do it here or we can do it offline. I think we need a more clear articulation of what it is specifically, because when I read the letter, I only saw two categories. There was a reference to, are we seeking to recover post March 31st, 2025 catastrophic storm costs? That was category one. The second category I saw was a reference to documents that are currently in the record but have not yet been produced in a public redacted format on Pura's website. If there are some other categories of information, they are unknown to us, and we appreciate understanding what those categories are. We would like a chance to respond to them.
So regarding specifically the storms, as we explained in our correspondence, there are storm reserve costs that are assuming total actual costs of storms for 2025. We don't have the total actual cost of storms for 2025. They are not providing them. They're providing the receipts and the verifications for 1/4 of the storms in 2025. And based on their testimony, they're not providing any more than that. They're not requesting recovery for that. But as a result, we don't know the full costs of that for 2025. We explained this in our correspondence.
So I think, just if I do understand, in our cost of service, we do have in there for point of reference only, 2025 costs using an average of, I believe it's 21 through 2025. I think that average comes out to $151 million, of which the company's proposal is only to remain at $60 million. So it's a point of reference. Nowhere in our application are we seeking recovery of 2025 costs post March 2025. Hopefully that clears that.
And I think the key point is we have to come back to what is the incremental revenue requirement the applicant is seeking to recover? And if we're not seeking to recover dollars for that particular period, we have a difficult time of understanding how somebody is saying that the application is complete. Why would we be providing information that's not relevant to or supportive of the actual dollars we're seeking to recover in our application? Now, if a party wants to ask a discovery question to get some historical context, we can respond to that accordingly. But for the purpose of the allegation, is the application complete? We're having a difficult time understanding how information for which we're not seeking cost recovery goes to the completeness of the application for rate relief that we're submitting.
As we stated earlier, part of that does result in a comparison with the test year O&M and how those two may affect each other. And if I could just add too, as we saw in the presentation, and I believe Attorney White alluded to it, similar issues are occurring with the capital additions. I believe the last date for the information for 2026, that was October 31st, 2026, was December 15th, which is just under a month prior to hearings.
Can I just zoom out a little bit and ask, legally, what does it mean for an application to be complete? Because when I read our regs, it seems to me, our very old regs that need a lot of help, it seems to me that what they say is they kind of define what must be included in an application. And they include like a couple of different references to PURA's power to reject an application or determine it's incomplete, but it seems like it's kind of narrowly defined. It seems like we can only do that where we determine that the application doesn't meet the requirements that are set out in the regs. And I'm not sure that the regs, for better or for worse, don't say, everything that the company wants on the record must be submitted when the application is filed. In fact, the regs lay out a couple of different provisions saying that there can be additional evidence. There is a reg, as I recall, saying that if the company wants to file additional evidence to supplement its application, it needs to ask us. But anyway, I'm not trying to make an argument. I guess I'm just asking for help from OCC and EOE. Like legally, like what is it that we can do to address this concern?
I've heard a lot of arguments about due process and fundamental fairness here in their last year. And I guess my thought regarding that is at some point that has to apply to us as well. If we receive an application on July 14th and we're not really receiving the majority of the application until December, and we're then supposed to conduct a hearing on that in January, and we've had no opportunity to explore it whatsoever, we've been prejudiced by this process, or we can't meaningfully participate in this process. We can't represent ratepayers the way that we are statutorily obligated to do. So I understand your constraint, but as I said, I believe we are working under our own constraints ourselves.
Yeah, and believe me, I understand that constraint too from OCC's perspective, but I guess again, very mechanically and legally, wouldn't that be a problem? I mean, wouldn't the relief you request then at some future point be to say, hey, PURA, this stuff that just came in months late, you just shouldn't consider because we have a due process violation here, as opposed to what you're asking. I just don't know what is it that we can do right now legally to address that concern, that when this new information comes in, you'll have a constrained amount of time to review it before, like within the remaining docket procedure. I guess the question is like, isn't that a question maybe of admissibility as opposed to rather whether the application is complete?
I think it could be a question of both. And I also think you have the opportunity available to you to extend the time frame based on the timing in which the application is fully presented to you.
Chair, I'd like a chance to respond if I could, and we agree with the articulation that you made in terms of what legal parameters exist to allow the agency to evaluate a claim of incompleteness, right? Because that's the claim that's being raised here. The allegation is the application is incomplete. There'll be an opportunity to ask for information later in the process through discovery. We're in discovery now, and they can ask for information they deem is relevant. But I do think it's important to look at the words of the statute, which are binding here. So I'm reading from 1619 subsection A. It says, each public service company shall file any proposed amendment of its existing rates with the authority in such form and in accordance with such reasonable regulations as the authority may prescribe. And it's referring to regulations. As you pointed out, what are the relevant regulations that apply to an application to amend rates? Well, the most important of which is 16-1-53A, which says you shall comply with the standard filing requirements. There's no allegation here that the information that is alleged to be missing from the application is in the standard filing requirements. There's also a reference to comply with 16-1-14, which is the authority's regulation on the format of submitting information. And there's no detail there that says things need to be redacted and so forth. And if we look at 16-1-49, it says that when the authority looks at the application If you believe that there is information that you want us to add, it prescribes what the process is. It says you provide us with notice, and we have at least 30 days to respond. It also goes on to say that if your request for information is voluminous, we have even more time. And so that we think that's a correct reading of the law, which is we don't look to subjective viewpoints of parties with allegations of what is complete or incomplete. We look to the authority's regulations. And there's no claim here that I've heard today or in the prior filing that the information they're looking for is mandated by a regulation. And so I would agree that there is no valid claim of incompleteness. Now, if they're looking for more information, that's why we have the discovery process, and we are happy to respond to and provide information to help them develop their positions as long as the request for information is relevant to the issues being adjudicated in this docket.
I think just as a general follow-up, I mean, in previous rate cases where the authority has determined that an application is incomplete, everyone knows it because PURA puts out a notice that says, hey, you're missing ABC, these items, please submit them. I think moving forward, it would be helpful to do that anyway and say, PURA has received an application, we've reviewed it, it's complete. That way, all of the parties know, all right, the hourglass has been flipped over, the clock's ticking, let's get going. And we don't have to sort of triangulate around what we should do or do not. If we might, all have differing opinions about whether an application is complete or not, we'll at least have a definitive statement from the authority in the record.
You agrees with that?
Yeah, and I did notice, I was randomly looking at some docket from 30 years ago, and that did appear to be a thing, that there was like a certification of completeness. I'm not sure when that dropped off. But I did want to respond to Attorney Pace. I think you were kind of, I guess just what I want to say out loud again, maybe to OCC and EOEs. I'm looking at 16149. And what that says is where these rules require that specific exhibits or data be prepared and submitted as part of any petition or application, the authority may, within 30 days of the filing thereof, after notice of opportunity to be heard, reject any petition or application or any portion of an application, et cetera, that the authority finds to have failed to comply with criteria for submission of exhibits and data as set forth in these rules. That's what I'm referencing. Like, I think doesn't that constrain us to say, wouldn't we need to identify a violation of the regulations itself in order to determine that an application is not complete? And if so, I don't know, is there one that supports EOE and OCC's concern?
We're just pulling up the statute.
And it's a reg, to be clear.
16-1-49, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Chair Will, may I just offer a comment while they're looking? The documentation regarding storm costs and capital additions, that's information that seems to be really critical to a large amount of the relief requests in the application. It's also documentation which is really beyond CIC's resources to fully review and investigate. And CIC, as I assume most, if not all of their customers, are relying on OCC and DOE and other state entities, as applicable, to do that deep dive and really investigate the information provided in support of the request for relief. So I don't know if it's an issue of, is the application complete or incomplete, or if this goes more to admissibility. But if there is information lacking or information will be updated in such a way that OCC at least does not have an opportunity to fully investigate it, have time in the process to fully investigate it, that would be deeply troubling for CIC because, again, all customers are relying on this investigation to validate or not what is a really staggering proposed increase in distribution rates.
So I'm going to try to ask a question that's sort of a legal question, so I apologize for my lack of legal education, but how does the completeness or incompleteness of an application relate to the ultimate ability to bear the burden of proof. In other words, if you submit an incomplete application, are you opening yourself up to a weaker substantiation in terms of meeting that burden, if that makes sense?
I appreciate that comment, Commissioner Beecher. I think that's really the issue. Ultimately, all parties want to review all the related information. We want the ability to ask questions about it, and the company certainly wants to provide the evidence to meet that burden of proof. And I think really where our initial correspondence sort of rests is we don't think the company is going to be able to do that. We haven't received the information. We can't review the information. And it is casting into doubt early on, at least, that burden's going to ever be met, at least on specific issues. Legality that Chairman Wheel is pointing up is important and very appropriate. But I do think, Commissioner Beecher, you sort of hit the nail on the head of what our concerns are.
I mean, it shouldn't be everybody's concern in this room.
I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of everybody.
Neither do I. But I'm just saying, we all have obligations here, and we're all working, we will all work within this record. And I do think the applicant bears responsibility and a burden here. And so I think that's what we have to think about. Thank you.
If I could just add to that, there's again this allegation out there of the filing being incomplete. I think we've addressed the issue that we're not missing information for post March 30th, 2025 catastrophic storms because we're not seeking cost recovery. I think we've also talked about the other allegation out there, which is there's an allegation of because documents already in the record are not yet posted on the website in a public redacted format. We respectfully disagree. We think that that's not an issue of completeness. It's an issue of, is it available to the public to be able to see it? And I think this last issue that we're hearing, it sounds like there's a claim of incompleteness is if it's the information Mr. Murray went through on slide 7, which was, for example, we proposed to file on October 15th, 2026, the actual completed plant additions that'll go into service up through August 31st. Well, that's not an issue of us not providing the information. The point is it's plant additions that'll go into service as of August 31st. And so we're not holding back the information. Those plant additions will be in service August 31st, and we're going to give you the supporting information. And that's a process used in other rate cases. So it's not an issue of incompleteness. It's an issue of their plant additions going into service during the course of a rate case, and we'll provide you with the supporting information consistent with the way this issue's been handled in other rate cases.
Comes from the fact that the companies used to propose to get these capital additions and rates and didn't have to produce any documentation, and it would go into rates. And then there was complaints from the parties, valid, that they needed something to review, so they needed the project documentation. So this came into a process where you do update the project documentation to get the newest in service. So this has been an iteration, and now it's like the whole idea is getting flipped around, that now this is somehow, but is somehow a negative when it's actually a positive, because the companies were proposing this, and to get it into rates, we're getting it into rates without the documentation. So it's a little bit circular, and I go back to where Chair Wheel was. I think this is just an issue for the litigation, for arguments as to whether they've had enough time, whether we've produced it well enough, organized enough. These are all litigation issues, for sure, fairly litigation issues.
And if I could just add one quick question. Oh, I apologize. Because then you can also respond to this, Council Coleman. Should the authority be parsing the difference between completeness of the application and transparency of the application? so that the public can adequately engage in this proceeding.
Thank you. I think you've hit on, this is a multifaceted concern for us. It's our ability to prepare and evaluate the case fairly, as well as the transparency and the ability for the public and the residents, those who are forced to pay Eversource bills, can understand what the request for the application is. I did want to point out that Attorney Pace referenced the October 15th update, but their slides also showed that by September 15th, the company will support actuals through June 30th, 2026. Those actuals are in. If our PFT testimony evaluating the capital additions that that Eversource is seeking to include in rates is due a month later, that just doesn't give us enough time to fairly evaluate that. It leaves us in an impossible situation. So from that perspective, it is incomplete, given that we have milestone interim deadlines throughout this process. It prejudices our ability to put on our case when we have a delay in that documentation.
We're happy to respond to the Consumer Counsel's concern if her request is she wants an opportunity to be able to supplement her pre-filed testimony, to have her expert respond to these additional capital plant additions. We don't have any objection to that. So that if the concern here is due process, the remedy would be provide a procedural remedy, which is allow for a supplemented pre-filed testimony to give them their fair chance to offer their reaction to these additional plant additions.
And I just want to jump in, but to get back to the chairman's original question, if based on the regulations, what is the legal argument that you are supplying here that this is an incomplete application? Because I think, if I'm echoing the chairman's concern, that is what I am certainly looking for. I'm not going to speak for everyone else. And there's a difference between an incomplete application and the information you desire to be there, if I'm understanding correctly. There's a preference as opposed to, is the application actually incomplete in the view of the authority?
Thank you, Commissioner Cheeseman. I think the authority should be evaluating this in terms of, can the parties fairly evaluate the application? There was no statutory requirement for Eversource to file on July 14th. They have the burden of proof. It's their responsibility to produce a complete application that allows us time to evaluate it within the statutory timeframe that kicks off upon that filing and the authority's declaration that there is a complete application. So I think, while to your point, completeness, there is a level of subjectivity, there is also a reasonable person standard. And I think you can evaluate the due process considerations through that lens. I hope that helps.
I was also going to follow up to the chair's question, his initial question. I've been doing some research over here, and it would appear that in the 1980s, the DPUC was quite fond of rejecting rate applications as being incomplete. And it seems like the process that the DPUC at the time followed, and I'm looking at the Helms Water Company from 1984 and CLMP's rate case from 1982, what the DPUC would do is actually have a show cause hearing. Whereas if there was a question about whether the application was complete or not, the authority would, or the department at that time would order the company to show cause that the application was complete, and there'd be some sort of process to them say, hey, no, we have everything we need or we don't. And that's the process that the DPUC followed. It also appears that, there's a question of what is the legal standard. And it seems like the DPUC at the time, at least, it considered itself to have some latitude of discretion as to what it considered to be a complete application or not. I'm looking at, and this one's a more recent case. This is Jewett City Water's 2000 rate case. In that case, the the department at the time had ordered Jewett City in the future to include all sorts of additional information that hadn't been in its initial application, and said in the future, if this information isn't there, the application will be deemed incomplete under the regulation that we're discussing. So I agree that regulation is not particularly illuminating just on its face, but it looks like in the way it's been used in the past by the department, the authority's predecessor, has been with some flexibility to try to get what it needs to make this determination of whether an application is complete or not. So I think that is what the department did in those prior cases is something to keep in mind moving forward if we're ever in this position again.
If I could add to that as well, and I apologize, Attorney Minikowski said this. 1613 is the waiver of the rules regulation, where good cause appears, the commissioners and any presiding officer may permit deviation from these rules except where precluded by statute.
So what rule should we deviate from?
I mean, arguably the one we're discussing of what is when the commission is allowed to deem a application incomplete, 16149.
Okay. I guess I do want to say, like, I totally understand the substantive arguments that are being provided here. I'm just really focused on what exactly, first, I mean, backing up, there isn't even a motion, right? Like we haven't been asked by anyone to find that the application is incomplete. We've just got correspondence sort of saying we don't think it's complete. So is there a motion either what are we being asked to do here? I need to know that.
I think this brings it all the way back to the beginning of this conversation before all of the attorneys got into the weeds, as we tend to do. I won't speak on behalf of OCC, but we believe that correspondence to flag the issue for the authority, should the authority believe it required further consideration. We were uncertain of whether the status of the application was complete or incomplete, and we're flagging it as an issue. I cannot speak for OCC, but EOE, if the authority says the application is complete, I don't think we're going to argue with that. But we wanted to make sure that all considerations were in front of the authority for the authority to make a full decision, and that's really it.
All right, thank you. I will second that. From our perspective, without any other guidance, we have been just presuming the application is complete, and we needed to ask discovery. So we presumed without the guidance that you were still debating this issue. If not, then we're good.
Okay. I think we've once again talked this weedy procedural issue to death, unless anyone has any other questions. I had just two, I see it's already 12:12 too. So maybe we get through these next two faster, which maybe are less controversial. We'll see. The next thing I wanted to ask about is there are some topics at issue in this case that might benefit from being discussed potentially in a technical meeting. And I'm specifically thinking as an example, although not the only one, in docket 25-1213, which is Eversource's storm docket, the decision in that case expressed the commissioner's interest in re-examining the storm cost recovery model. Of course, the company's application has a proposal. We'll see whether any other parties or interveners file testimony proposing their own thing. But to me, some part of that, at least for our consideration, is sort of thinking above and beyond sort of evidence that's tested by cross-examination in a hearing, and more about sort of like policy questions, regulatory policy questions that, from my perspective, it makes more sense to just sort of have a discussion about, because some of this sort of just falls in our discretion no matter what, right? Like everyone could put on witnesses saying, here's what we think the best storm cost recovery model is. But so long as we're not actually prejudicing the right of an entity, like we kind of just get to decide whatever we want. So in a way, a normal evidentiary process isn't really a great way to like have that conversation and get input from people to kind of talk about broadly sort of regulatory framework questions. So anyway, again, that's just an example, but I wanted to throw up there. It's not a good thing to say. An idea of having a technical meeting in a rate case. What do people think about that? Is that a bad idea? Is that a good idea? What do you think?
I don't think we have an objection to it. I agree that the more exchange of information and understanding the commissioners obtain of all parties' perspectives, the more it will benefit the end result. So while we do have some staffing and budget constraints, with those caveats, strategic use of technical sessions does seem beneficial.
Assuming you did not see my facial expression, which is, yeah, sure. I don't think we object to that either. Noting the same objections that Consumer Council, I was going to say Claire and Coleman and Consumer Council.
Claire's fine. C4 I've been referred to lately.
Kind of like it.
So in particular on policy issues, we have no objection to a technical meeting to encourage dialogue. It's not a blanket waiver of the right to cross-examine. It all depends what comes out of that and how is it being used. But conceptually, we would support one or more technical meetings to encourage dialogue sitting around the table on policy issues.
Thanks. And yeah, I guess my thought, sorry, Attorney Minikowski, my thought is that I think there's a blend in any issue that we talk about where I think there is a right to, there are factual findings that we're going to have to come to that are under the UAPA, but just using storm costs, again, as a totally hypothetical example, at some point we need to figure out like, how often, what month are we going to use to look at this? And what exactly do we want to ask for? And we could just issue all that as compliance filings without just do it ourselves without kind of asking, but stuff happens where people are like, oh, we're fine with this, except it'd be great if it was in August or what, that's the kind of thing that I'm getting at is things that I don't think are necessarily contentious or questions of fact or law before the authority, but just sort of more nuts and bolts, if we're going to make changes, what's the best way to make them? That's what I'm wondering. Anyway, Attorney Minikowski. Okay, and keeping in mind that no one even knew I was going to ask this question, does anyone have any thoughts on where in the procedural schedule would make sense? Not even necessarily dates, but like when do we do this? Before hearings, but before oral arguments? Anyone have any ideas on where we would put something like a general technical meeting?
I mean, CLMP would welcome the commissioner's recommendation on that in terms of sitting down with your staff and making an adjustment to the schedule, because whatever serves your interests best and your staff members' interests best in terms of when's the right time to have it. So we would defer to you in terms of picking the right spot in the calendar that meets your needs.
I just want to flag as an issue. I don't necessarily have an opinion on where so much, but we have a short, statutory just length, but short time span to do everything. And it's a lot of issues that we're reviewing in this docket. And there are, portions of months that are just unusable. Because rightfully everyone should be able to enjoy their holidays. So I want to we also need ample time for discovery. So just fitting it while being cautious of where is very important given the timing that we have.
So the Friday after Thanksgiving is not a good idea.
I'll be here.
Okay. The last thing I wanted to add, these are mostly just sort of things wanted to notify people of. First, I just wanted to celebrate I think what will be my greatest achievement as chairman, which is that there is now an OCC table in this room, which is in the back. And the purpose of that is for OCC staff who have to sit in here for 8 hours a day, every day during hearings, have an actual spot to where they don't have to balance their laptops on their knees. But we haven't forgotten about the company. I also want to announce our intention for this and every other rate case. We're going to open hearing room 3, which is that one over there, to allow the companies to use, so you guys don't have to go outside in the rain to talk about, to talk to your attorneys, or it's a place you can keep things. There are mics in there, but I promise we're not listening. So that's we're gonna open that up for the once hearings start also. And I think that's all I had. I don't know if anyone else had anything to add. Okay, so I think next steps, we're gonna issue a schedule. We'll take all this input into consideration. We'll issue a procedural schedule. Oh, Attorney Bogan is that kid who
I apologize,
is
Mr. Chairman.
delaying lunch break.
I assure you, I'll be uncharacteristically brief. And I did not raise this with the joint movements. The date for the rebuttal testimony, I believe, is currently December 9th. I assume there was some method to the madness there. I'm wondering if the joint movements would consider December 11th, just an additional 2 days, in keeping with the Thanksgiving reference, because we do have the intervening holiday. That is all.
Not speaking for others, but we have no objection to that request.
EU has no objection.
It's OCC.
Okay, sounds like OCC also doesn't have an objection. Okay, so next steps, we're going to issue a procedural schedule that is hopefully going to be the final schedule on the docket, but as we've done in other recent cases, if any party intervener has a huge problem with what we put on the schedule, you can file a motion asking for an amendment to the schedule. But we're going to be grumpy when we get that motion. So that's sort of the next docket event, since we don't have any other events scheduled. So we will, I guess we'll see everyone at the public comment hearings when that's the next kind of time where I'll be together. So thanks everyone and have a great day.